Hercules swept Cerberus right off his feet and effortlessly set him down as softly as a songbird. Atlas kept the world upon his back.
Legend says that Hercules swept Cerberus right off his feet and effortlessly set him down softly as a songbird. Atlas kept the world upon his back and every day wondered whether he could stand it any longer. And Reade came out to say the man they tried to label the messiah of morality was really just another rapist. And I don't intend to hesitate when asked who was the stronger. Tara, like Assange, knew that carrying the truth would be the hardest labor. Tara knew that her assailant wasn't gonna make us any safer. And knew he's just the type of man to hand a decent foreign leader US printed walking papers. And knew he'd be relentless and aggressive in the war he'd wage upon her very character. That his attempts to weaken and degrade and embarrass her would be her only compensation. But I strongly doubt that anyone could ever have foreseen the stream of hate that came from quote-unquote progressives and the self-styled titans of survivor advocation. So if you really think there's something to be gained out of sharing your pain with the world, you are sorely mistaken. The Biden team just dragged their feet addressing Tara's allegations. Until they had a decent list of smears, then they aired them out on every station. And it turns out no one wants to hear the truth of who they praised as being worthy of such bloated liberal celebration. That no one wants to really know the person they've so valiantly defended, even when it meant they had to gloat and shit all over someone braver than they'd be if given the occasion. Now cue the faceless comment squad invasion. Cue those fuckers crawling out the woodwork to come analyze the way you wore your hair and what you wear. Like your appearance waives your rights, or that somehow you're the reason for your situation. Somehow they've decided you should bear responsibility for what such monstrous men insist on doing. Somehow they're deluded by the empty, hypocritical, and useless fucking platitudes that bastard keeps on spewing. And I think it's very telling that the best of their excuses when they try to come and justify our president's abuses is a hearty butt Trump. In which case I'll remind you that you never saw the news attempt to sell us Donald Trump like he was morally upstanding or a decent human. But when Joe says something bigoted or ogles someone's little kid, CNN says, isn't this refreshing? Biden's like a mix of JFK and FDR with all the finer parts of Harry Truman. Christ, I know that they don't think that we're the brightest, but at least pretend we got a couple lumens. Ask yourself if you have ever questioned what they fed you, or do you just shut your eyes and then consume it? And now ask yourself if you ate every one of Biden's lies under guise of harm.
Welcome back to the Politics of Survival. I'm your host, Tara Reade, and it has been a minute, all right? It's been a month and 10 days or so, and yes, I'm still in Moscow. Remember that 1 week vacation I was taking, and then it ended up being a little longer. So for those of you that saw my last podcast, they just went ahead and just played my press conference, and I appreciate all the support and love I've been getting and the messages. And for those that are calling me a traitor, whatever. I'm not, and I enjoy being in Moscow, Russia, and it is beautiful here. People have been wonderful. I've gotten to travel a little bit and see some other parts, like the Southern Caucasus, which are amazing. Sochi, St. Petersburg. And what I can tell you is that the people are amazingly warm and kind, and the country is not affected by sanctions as we're being told and pummeled with all the American propaganda. And one of the people that I connected with while I was here in Moscow, whom I knew of through RT and then got to know a little bit better, is someone I admire greatly for his work. He's a very fun but yet serious correspondent that works with RT, and he's seen a lot. He knows a lot, and he's from one of my favorite places, and of course has a little bit of my heritage in it as well, Ireland. And he just recently spoke at the UN. So without further ado, I want to introduce my friend and colleague, Chay Bowes. Chay, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tara, thanks for asking me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So, you know, I didn't give your bio, but I'd like you to tell the audience a bit about yourself before we get into your UN appearance real quick, if you don't mind, and just how you became an RT correspondent and came up to that point.
Yeah, well, I suppose I'm Irish, as you say, and I've always been interested in sort of civil society kind of stuff. Most recently, I worked in Ireland with a guy called Paddy Cosgrave, the guy who founded the Web Summit, probably the world's biggest tech conference. We worked together. We started to work together probably around 2019, 2020. We exposed the Irish Prime Minister's corruption through the Village magazine. We wrote about it, which sparked a 2-year investigation into him for corruption, essentially, which went on for a long time. And through that, we established another investigative media platform called Ditch Media, which I have nothing to do with anymore, but I helped establish. And the guys at Ditch have, really, taken the scalps of several government ministers now over sort of petty corruption in the planning. It's led to the resignation of the state sort of planning, the building sort of processes in Ireland. Ireland's sort of racked with this petty corruption as well. So Paddy and I worked on that. We worked with Village magazine on the scandal around the leaking of significant valuable documents as well from the Prime Minister, who's still the Prime Minister, by the way, and his deputy Prime Minister, who recently.
But didn't he get arrested, like, as a result of your investigation?
Yeah, by appointment, basically. Yeah, but I mean, still, it was a big deal. It was the biggest political story in Ireland over the last 20 years, probably. But he's been racked with controversy. You know, he's this dynamic sort of gay guy. He was going to be the cure for Ireland, sort of backslappery, this type of old boys club. But he's just turned out to be just as creepy and as slippery as the rest of them. And the stuff I personally did, and more lately the Ditch has done, has really exposed that sort of corruption. So in my background, I spent some time in the Irish Army. I was trained as a paramedic, a combat paramedic in the Army. I've done a lot of work in that sort of space as well. And then through that, I ran some businesses, and I'm familiar with how the system works in Europe and in Ireland in business, and bought and sold some businesses. Spent some time in the Army, as you say, and also then decided to do a bit more research work on strategic studies, geopolitics and history and that type of stuff. So I did a master's degree in strategic studies, which is the specific study of war, conflict, and that sort of space. So did that, and then, in the last number of years, since the sort of the Maidan coup in 2014, when the legitimately elected government of Ukraine, imperfect government of Ukraine, was overturned by what is basically a CIA-backed coup d'etat. And, we know they do this stuff.
Yeah.
Michael Bolton, and they've all admitted they do it.
Victoria Nuland. Yeah. Wherever she goes, there's a coup. Yeah.
Victoria Nuland's sort of famous phone call, "Fuck the EU," where she admitted they basically selected the new government in the Maidan. Mm-hmm. So since that time, I've been writing about, the reality of this sort of movement to destabilize Ukraine, about Crimea, about the historical background. I've written a lot of fairly significant pieces on it. I did my thesis about it, NATO and a resurgent Russia. And so I've spent a lot of time looking at this stuff, trying to learn the language. doing some work with media in Russia, getting to understand the very complex reality of the demography of Ukraine, this stratified world where the line between what is Ukraine and Russia is very blurred. Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, the Slavic world. It's exceptionally complex and beautiful and, what's the word? Hard to decipher. So that's why this narrative in the West that, that Russia's waging a war against Ukraine culturally and stuff, it just doesn't wash. So that's kind of my background. And more recently, and for the last year, really, I've been living in Russia. I did a lot of work with RT over the last year and a half. They offered me a role as a correspondent here. I did some work in Ireland, writing a lot of pieces to try and counter this narrative about Russia, that they're solely responsible for this conflict in Ukraine. And through that, I ended up living in Moscow. I came last year for the first time to live. The first time in Russia was in 2015. I have a lot of Russian friends, a lot of Ukrainian friends, a lot of people who consider themselves Russian and Ukrainian and both. A lot of people who support what's happening, a lot of people who are kind of concerned about it. So I've kind of tried to immerse myself in that to try and give people an idea of what's really happening here, rather than this mainstream media narrative, this drive-through narrative of black and white, the good guys and the bad guys, this Star Wars narrative that we seem to need in the West. We can't spend the time to actually understand the finesse, the complexity of any kind of conflict. It's like Muslims are bad, the Red Indians are bad, the Irish are bad, the British are bad. So we don't take the time to actually understand the complexity. So we need this drive to narrative. We need the fear. The fear drives the military-industrial complex, which has been creating every catastrophic war since the end of the Second World War. The United States has really been at the center of every conflict. Tens of millions of people have died, all based on this predication of this replication of this neo-conservative American world. You're either with us or against us. The Muslim world were the enemies. The Soviets were the enemies. It's all come full circle now. And of course, Russia is now the enemy, because Russia intervened militarily in a country which bordered it, whereas America had intervened in dozens of countries, none of which bordered America. But when Russia does it, after basically pleading with the Western world to listen to its security concerns over decades, Russia becomes this demonized, hated country. Even dead Russians now terrify the West, apparently, because this is a country apparently when that where.
Well, you listen to the rhetoric and the Aristophobia, and it's startling, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just insane. It's insane. And even I've met a lot of people here in Russia who also feel that it's time to give up on the West. And my job and what I try to do is say, to connect ordinary Russian people and ordinary Americans and Europeans with each other and say we share so much culturally. We're a Judeo-Christian sort of culture. We culturally, the beauty of Russian culture, literature, music, art. It's such a culturally rich, beautiful place. The West has so much to learn from Russia, from its diversity culturally, particularly like there's over 170 languages in Russia, like there's 12 time zones. Islam is everywhere. There's so many different religions, and it's a genuine melting pot where nobody is sort of on top of anybody else really regarding culture. And you got Islamic republics like Tatarstan and Kazan, a place I visited, and I've tried to do videos to show people that there is probably a better way. We've so much to learn from Russia. Russia has problems, without a doubt. Russia has problems. Of course it does. Every society has problems. But coming from sort of a ultra-liberal European state like Ireland, which has basically dumped all of its cultural history into this pro-NATO sort of narrative that this LGBT plus, which is fine. I mean, here in Russia, there's plenty of gay people. I mean, I actually got thrown out of a gay bar about 10 days ago for being not gay enough, actually, which I thought was really funny in Moscow. Me and a mutual friend of ours, Tara, actually, we went into this gay bar in Moscow, and it's funny, I was listening to your interview, I think it was with Megyn Kelly. Was it?
Yeah, Megyn Kelly, yeah.
And she said, being gay is illegal in Russia. I mean, I just thought that was so insane. I mean, there's plenty of gay people in Russia. There's plenty of, you can be anything you want to be in Russia. It's just that the state, I suppose, doesn't advocate or promote any particular type of sexuality, other than, the family is probably at the center of the Russian constitution, I'd imagine. But, I actually got thrown out of a gay bar about 10 days ago because I wasn't gay enough, apparently. And they asked me, are you gay? I said, well, I'm not actually gay. And they said, well, you got to get out of here because the gays don't like people like you hanging around in here. So we all got thrown out of the gay bar. So this is just a fantastic reality of Moscow. It's a city that never sleeps. You got so many,
right,
wonderful people, so many divergent views. And of course, this idea that nobody in Russia can have an opinion, or everyone's telling you what to do. And you vouch for this. Nobody's ever told me what to say, think, or do here, ever. No,
right.
Never. Even I work in the media here, and well, as you say, I appeared at the UN. And if I had done that for the Irish government when they were had a seat on the Security Council, or the British government, they would have gone through that speech that I was going to make with the tweezers. They would have managed every fractional part of that in case I annoyed somebody or said the wrong thing or offended somebody. Nobody in the Russian delegation that invited me to speak about the
no, they're not going to tell you what to do. And as a matter of fact, I wanted to let's talk about that. I because I admire your work so much, I was able to through a mutual friend be able to submit your name for the UN Security Council. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, about how that transpired, about like how you prepared and what that was like, your speech that you gave recently, because it was very powerful. You and Max Blumenthal were very, very, it was really great. I'm sorry that the mainstream press suppressed it. It shouldn't be suppressed. It should be out there more. And so that's why I wanted to kind of highlight it a bit.
Yeah, well, thanks. I suppose it's a huge platform, and it's an opportunity to reach out to people without this filter, which is
it becomes a historical record.
Yeah, I mean, what we said at the UN Security Council, it's interesting that everything we said at the UN Security Council, of everything we said, none of the British or American delegations, to the diplomatic delegations to the UN, challenged us on any of the factual issues that we raised. I raised several factual issues reported in the New York Times and the BBC, but I also raised issues around Ukraine's functionality as a state. What kind of country Ukraine is, what kind of country are American taxpayers being asked to pump tens of billions of their hard-earned taxpayers' dollars into. And I quote only from US State Department data. And one of the central pieces that I quoted from, Tara, was a report in 2019 where they basically said that Ukraine was a dysfunctional, lawless state, that judicial corruption was widespread.
It was the most corrupt country in the world at one time. Well,
essentially, yeah. I mean, and this is the US State Department. So, about judicial corruption, oppression of the opposition, corruption, endemic corruption, so that the country was basically incapable of functioning in any sort of validated sort of way in a Western democracy, that the opposition politicians and parties were being oppressed, imprisoned, killed, that people were being disappeared, violence against women. And what's very interesting as well was that they made a point of pointing out the violence, the targeted violence against LGBT individuals, people in Ukraine, that the state basically turned a blind eye to that targeted brutalization of people from these communities, that violence against women was endemic, that freedom of the press was basically non-existent, that the state controlled the media, and that the state basically was imprisoning its political opponents. So fast forward basically 2 years, and you've got a country which is being, portrayed as the bastion and the center of all liberal, democratic, freedom, and that the American people are expected to, while 40 million of their co-Americans, if you like, or their co-taxpayers are living in poverty, huge problems with immigration, with social disharmony, So you know better than me the problems in American society around these issues, which are bipartisan. There's no centralized narrative here around this. America is in a lot of trouble, and tens of millions of Americans are living in poverty, fentanyl, drug abuse, gun crime, racism, all of these things, which aren't getting any better, and they're not getting any better under Biden.
No. In fact, it's getting much worse. In fact, my daughter just was telling me that, like LA, she just recently went there. It's like a wasteland. She said, Mom, you wouldn't even recognize it. It's a wasteland.
And in the midst of this, Joe Biden seems to want to give tens of billions of dollars to probably the country that his administration and the Obama administration called probably the most corrupt on earth.
Well, Chay, why would they do that logically, right? Because they can money launder. Because they can.
Who is Joe Biden's son? He ended up on the board.
Scandal kind of showed. Yeah.
Hunter Biden ended up on the board of a Ukrainian state gas company, and he had freely admitted that he only got that job because of what his last name was. He admitted that. I think it was to CBS. He said, I would never have got that job if my surname hadn't been Biden, and we all know the stuff about the big fella. Not that Joe Biden knows now what day of the week it is. I mean, it's almost shameful, this elder abuse that's rolled out every day. But Biden for sure, and you would know better than most, Tara, about this man. He's a sort of insipid character who likes to play the role of, the average Joe with the sleeves rolled up. But there's a lot of darkness there. And I mean,
a lot of darkness, a lot of insecurity, insecurity.
And so the Hunter stuff recently, the cocaine found in the White House, we were talking about that today. We're kind of laughing about it,
Oh, that's in the White House library. Yeah.
And this clown show with this Jean Pierre, this spokesperson, it's I don't know what's more laughable, her or her boss, but basically, this is the sort of narrative that we must defend freedom. What kind of freedom we're defending is, let's forget about that. Anyone who asks the question, like I've done, says, well, this is the country that you think is defending freedom. Russia's not our enemy. It's just not your enemy. Russia is very comparable. There's a huge Russian ethnic population in the United States. The two countries have very little to differentiate themselves. Russia's not a communist state. That the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, and Russia is probably the most aggressively capitalist country outside of the US on earth. So Russia is a country that is, its engine is capitalism now, and it's a country where, as it's all about business. People are doing business. They're pushing.
You're exactly right.
You see this country. There's nothing you can't. You probably get more of everything you want here, a lot cheaper than you can anywhere in the United States. But you can do it without being mugged, shot, fucking attacked, or you can do it very safely here. I mean, which is the remarkable thing. When people come here from the West, they say, where's the lawlessness? What have I been told for so long? I mean, it doesn't materialize. It doesn't exist. Russia's an exceptionally safe country to do business in. It's a safe country the first time I got here, but several years ago, I kind of looked out my window and I seen a woman walking through a park right by my apartment that I was renting at 3 a.m. with a small dog, this very glamorous looking lady. And back home in Dublin, if I saw a woman walking through a park on her own at 3 a.m., I would call the cops and say, there's some lunatic walking through the park. She's going to be killed. But I started to realize that women here can walk on the streets without fear of being harassed.
Nice. I've discovered that too. Like I'm moving around, and it is one of the safest cities I've ever been in. I feel,
it's remarkable.
Every city has crime, right? But like, I haven't experienced anything even that has given me pause. It's very safe to walk around. And people are very sincere and actually helpful, because I'm usually lost. So, and I don't know. So, I mean, but people are just nice and kind. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I suppose that also feeds into this idea that Russians won't tell you what they think about something. It's hard to stop Russians telling you what they think once they start talking to you. And like this default Russian psyche, in my view, and what I understand of the Russians as I get to know them better. I mean, they're an enigmatic people, right? And it's such a mix of ethnicities. You got Buryatians, you got Dagestanis, Chechens, you got people from all the different Tatarstan, you got people from southern Russia. So it's this huge post-Soviet melting pot, particularly in the big cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg. And nobody here, from a taxi driver to a producer to a senior business person, none of them have been remotely scared or worried about telling me what they think about what's happening in the world, what's happening in Russia, what's happening in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Nobody.
They're not afraid.
And absolutely nobody in the media where I'm working right now has said to me, you can say this, don't say that. There's no red lines, don't say this, don't say that. And that's borne out by going to the UN to give a speech invited by the Russian delegation. And nobody even asked to see my speech before I went and gave it. Nobody even asked me. If that had been the United States, I mean, also, you see Putin, he'll speak for 6 hours in front of a huge cadre of journalists, foreign, domestic, speak for hours without notes about what's happening in his country. But of course, the Western media will say that this is a controlled space. You know, it's this authoritarian hell. And I can't seem to find it. You know, of course, Russia is different. Russians do things differently. It's a culturally different country. So are many countries. But this narrative that we're fed in the West, you really start to wonder when you get here for a long time. You say, why are they telling us to be? Why are we so scared? Why do they want us to be so scared of Russia? So you got to ask yourself, why should I be so scared of the Russians? Like, have the Russians invaded Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Operation Condor in South America? Was that the Russians? Did the Russians run the British Empire, which, you know, basically squeezed the marrow out of the whole Southern Hemisphere for nearly 200 years? You know, did the Russians run the international slave trade? Was it the Russians, you know, who generated this whole fear mongering sort of narrative around brown people, Islam? You know, it just wasn't Russia. So Russia doesn't have that sort of imperial baggage. The Russian Empire was huge, but it was an empire which expanded from its base in Russia, and a lot of that's related to now what a lot of the problems we have post-Soviet, the post-Soviet world. But you got to understand that this whole, you know, fear Russia narrative it serves a purpose for this look the other way narrative. I mean, people like Boris Johnson, people like you know, Joe Biden, who are failing their own people and have failed their own people regarding domestic policies in many ways. It's always profitable to have a war. The military-industrial complex that funds, donates more money to both political parties in the United States are you know, profligate on this fear narrative, you know, and so the media is complicit in that. So why would you expect anything different? They don't want to come here and actually walk around and actually talk to people who are completely bemused when you talk to them about this narrative in the West, you know, and a lot of liberal Russians are kind of going, oh gosh, you know, we wish things were different. And I'm kind of saying to them, you know what? It doesn't matter how things are going to be. The West hates you now. And this hatred of all things Russia, culturally, economically, has kind of been in the pipeline for probably a couple of 100 years. I mean, you go back to the
if you go back, it's you know, it's gone back some decades. I mean, it's a convenient enemy for the military industrial complex, right?
Yeah, sure.
But you know what? It's like a warm-up act before the US turns its sights on China.
Yeah, 100%. And that's so important. That's such a good point. And of course, walk around Moscow now or any of the big cities, you see all these Chinese cars, these great Chinese cars, like that are basically replacing all the European brands, the Opels or the Fiat or, you know, the Ford, the American brands. They just don't exist anymore, but they're all Haval and Chery and all these really slick looking Chinese cars. So this sort of vacuum that's been created by a very foolish, you know, collective self-harm in the West to cut off their companies from vast Russian markets. Remember, Russia's not a country in the sense of the United States. Russia is a continent. It's the biggest landmass on Earth. It has like 12 time zones, 170 languages. It has a vast, unrivaled, and you can't compete against Russia's access to natural resources. It simply doesn't exist. And Russia is still a developing culture, I suppose, because of the invasion of Russia from Genghis Khan to Napoleon to Adolf Hitler. So Russia has been set back by these perpetual wars that have been fought against it. And that colors a lot of Russia's view of NATO and the West as well, which is something we could talk about maybe later. But what Russia now knows and understands is, Russia ordinary people say, well, everything was meant to collapse. But the worst thing that happened is Starbucks coffee is now called Stars coffee, and it's owned by a Russian. Or that McDonald's is now called Vkusna i Tochka, which means tasty, and that's it. But it's McDonald's, right?
I wanted to kind of look at that for a second. So, because the narrative was the sanctions were being used as, a very oppressive. Well, first they said it was a diplomatic tool, but it's not a diplomatic tool. It's, in my opinion, in some cases, it's a war crime. Like it's keeping people from getting goods and services that they need, not the elites in a country, but the working people. So the working people are harmed. And in countries that get sanctions, or like the Cuba being an example of the embargo, like how but they've still risen above it. They have the highest literacy rate in the world, and they've still moved on. Russia, what I've seen, which I really find is amazing, I wanted to ask you about this if you've noticed this in your time here. They seem to be taking it as a challenge and doing more manufacturing within and more creating their own products. Like you just mentioned, replacing, those star brands like Stars with the coffee and the McDonald's, but they're doing more than that. They're manufacturing their own thing. Do you find that expanding to different, different things, like even technology, or is it, do you think, mainly in agriculture?
Absolutely. And I mean, because of the work I do, I get to go to these conferences, the big Islamic business conference in Kazan, where Kazan is it's the capital of Islamic Russia, if you like. It's Tatarstan, and this vast arena that we go to these meetings for a Westerner to go, Jesus, how does this stuff exist? This huge oil-rich republic, Russian republic, ex-Soviet republic, but now part of the Russian Federation, where, you've got an Islamic republic. Imagine an Islamic republic in the United States. Imagine Texas or Nebraska was an Islamic republic. How impossible that sounds. But in Russia, no problem. Last week, Vladimir Putin turned up in, I think in Tashkent, in Derbent, while they're burning the Quran in Sweden and saying this is an expression of freedom of speech. And it's, it's obviously a hateful idea to stimulate, fractious sort of anger among the population. Vladimir Putin was saying, we respect the Quran. Burning the Quran in Russia is a crime, and we won't allow people to do it. He's a devout Christian. But, when I was in Kazan, one thing I noticed in the Kremlin, Kremlin means fortress, and many Russian cities will have a Kremlin, the biggest one being, of course, in Moscow. But in the Kremlin in Kazan, there's a huge mosque built in the center of the Kremlin. And right beside it, there's a Russian Orthodox church. And there's absolutely zero anger or competition between Orthodox Christianity and Islam, or no religion. You don't need to have a religion in Russia. Nobody really cares what you want to do in Russia. I suppose that's the difference between us and in the Western world. Something I've learned. It's like the whole LGBT thing of Pride Month. Back home in Ireland, if you don't participate in Pride Month, that's a bad thing. You become ostracized. I'm not really into Pride Month. It's not my thing. I'm not gay. I don't really. You're become a victim of this mobilized, centralized narrative. In Russia, nobody cares what you do behind the door of your apartment. Nobody cares who you're sleeping with, what your sexuality is. Nobody cares, and that's absolute. Nobody cares what you do, but you don't get to go out onto the street and then impose your view onto anybody else, because the state decides how that game is played. And some people have a big problem with that, but I don't have a big problem with that. I don't have a problem with being able to walk onto the metro in Moscow and go across one of the biggest cities in Europe, 22 million people living there, without fear of being accosted, harassed by a drug addict, by a criminal. It cost me a ruble to get on that transport system, one of the most modern on the planet. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with going on the Sapsan from Moscow to St. Petersburg, at 150 kilometers per hour in pristine conditions for a very cheap amount of money. I have no problem with seeing 3 cops walk in the street. Everywhere they go, there's 3 cops. I have no problem with that. Yeah. And I think most people in the West have no problem with that, but we've lost sight of the idea that the state here, for example, in Russia, the state takes its obligation to its citizens very seriously. In the West, we only take the obligation to the individual very seriously. It doesn't matter about society. So it doesn't matter if there's a tent city full of fentanyl addicts living under a bridge in LA. What the state will do is mobilize to defend the right of one guy to become a woman. Okay, he's on a Tuesday, he's a lady. On a Wednesday, he wants to be a guy. The state will mobilize huge resources to defend the right to do that, while ignoring the reality that the whole shit show is falling apart for average Joe who has no interest in that type of stuff. I think Russia has it right in that respect. And, you need to come and live the experience here. And some of my friends have done it, and they've come and they've said, they've left and they've said, what a massive propaganda operation has been deployed against us in the West to make places like Russia and China, to a great extent.
They don't want you to know how good it is here.
Well, I think that's...
and that you can actually live kind of well, and you can, things are less expensive. One statistic that I noted, and correct me if this is wrong, because you would know, Chay, more than me. You've been here longer. But 80 to 90% of Russians own their own apartments or homes, or dachas, which are vacation homes for those listening. And but they own them outright. A mortgage, not a mortgage at a bank. They 80 to 90% own them outright. Is that correct? That stat?
Yeah, this is also the reality here. But remember as well, in Libya, when Muammar Gaddafi outlawed landlords, and he made it an absolute necessity for young couples to own their own home, and the state decided to subsidize that. He was doomed when he wanted to nationalize the oil system, when he wanted to create a gold-backed Pan-African currency. He was doomed. So in Russia as well, I work in a big organization now here in Russia. There's thousands of employees. When a woman has a baby, she gets phenomenal, months and months and months off on full pay. There's creches in the office for women. And the family is very much at the center of Russian society. And that's not in a sort of religious way or a sort of controlling way. It's in a practical way. Women get very, very valuable financial support. Also, you can walk into a pharmacy anytime, day or night. They're open all the time. All these practical realities where, people have just said, well, let's do things differently and let's do them better. Medicines are much cheaper as well. Something I find coming from Ireland, where medicine is astonishingly expensive.
All right,
and
for instance, like Claritin,
sort of
right? Claritin is like this allergy pill you get in the West. It's $24 or $25 for a packet, like a little packet. In Russia, it's the equivalent of maybe $5.
Well, yeah, and, I bought some of this.
I have a special heart medicine that was like $800 per month $800 per month, almost like rent, right? In America, here it's $60, and it's the same exact medicine.
I sent my son. Everyone takes a Nexium now and then when they overdo it on the beer or the burgers, right?
What do they do?
Nexium, this anti sort of acid sort of medication. Back in Ireland, it's €18 for like 7 or 10 of them or whatever. Over here, I bought a box of 50 of them, and it was like less than €3. I'm thinking maybe they made a mistake in the pharmacy. I felt bad about it. I felt like going back in and saying, maybe you screwed this up. And then the lady said, no, it's all good. It's $3. I said, well, give me 5 boxes of those. So I took 5 boxes of them home, and I sat looking at them on the table going, maybe I should start exporting Nexium tablets back to, So it's kind of a mini description. But I suppose one of the more serious realities about living here, of course, is this idea that someone's watching you. There's somebody looking from between these two holes in a newspaper everywhere you go. Since I've arrived in Russia, nobody's asked to meet me. Nobody's asked to tell me what I can or can't say. Don't call it a war. Call it this.
Chay, do you want to know what happened to me last week? Somebody said to me, who was in the security, whatever, and whatever, back in the States, said, so has an FSB officer approached you yet? Have they talked to you or interviewed you? And I'm like, no. And I think that Moscow and Russia are a little busy right now. I don't think they know who I am or what I'm doing. Like, nobody cares. Right? But who does care is the NSA and CIA in the United States. So the only people looking through the doing the surveillance, that's happening over in the United States. Like when I came forward about Joe Biden, one of the first things they did was they opened in 2019, which I've just recently found out, they opened a FISA hearing, which, if for anyone who doesn't know what that means, it means that they can surveil you in very, very lots of ways. They can surveil you legally without your knowledge. And that's what America does. And I felt any of that here. That's why Julian Assange is in jail. Don't forget it.
Edward Snowden's here,
Edward Snowden's
for the same
here.
reason. There's a lot of people living here in Russia who, the minute you step off the plane, you say, well, I can say what I want to say. I can say without fear of being, my bank account shut or being castigated in the parliament. Like the Irish Prime Minister stood up in the parliament, or the deputy prime minister, as he was at the time, stood up in the parliament. Basically said, I was a spy, or that the media platform.
Stop there. The prime minister said you were a spy, a Russian spy.
Essentially, yeah. I'll paraphrase.
But on the parliament floor or out to media?
He said that the media platform that I had helped establish, which I had nothing to do with at the time after.
Oh my gosh.
Reversing that, because the Russian ambassador had cited an article I'd written where I said that the CIA had cultivated the war in Ukraine, as they have done. Right. We know that. In 30 years' time,
everybody knows that.
Everyone knows. The dogs in the street know that the CIA was behind the Maidan coup, that Victoria Nuland selected the new Ukrainian government. We know this, okay?
We know this.
But he tried to peddle the idea that because I had been dissenting from the narrative on Russia, on Crimea since 2014, writing very factually based articles. I'd studied this reality, that because I'd done that, and because the media platform that I had established had also led to the resignation of two of his ministers for corruption, by the way, let's not mention that, or his partner in government had been investigated for 2 years nearly by the highest level police, like the FBI, for example, in Ireland. Let's not forget about that this was somehow some sort of Russian operation. Because I disagree with the narrative on Crimea and on Ukraine, that everything else I'd done politically regarding challenging the dysfunction, challenging the reality that his political party had posed as a charity to raise money from these lotteries, which I challenged in the courts, which cost them probably $1 million, let's say. All of that's forgotten. Anybody who dissents from the narrative on Ukraine or the narrative on any of these pro-NATO sort of fantasy wars will be targeted, so they'll feel your color whatever way they can. So it goes to that sort of level. Yeah.
Well, I wanted to Reef, if you're there, I want you to put up his, I just want the audience to hear who may have missed it, because we have the link down below and we have where you can get Chay, but I wanted to show just a bit of your speech at the UN Security Council. If you could play that, please, Reef.
I now give the floor to Mr. Chay Bowes.
Well, thank you for asking me to appear, ladies and gentlemen and chairman. And despite well over a year of frenzied and what is now recognized as loosely regulated supply of incalculable numbers of weapons to Ukraine, sources within the country still maintain that it needs an escalating volume of heavy and light weapons and ammunition to conduct its operations. Weapons being supplied by NATO and their allies to Ukraine are being willfully targeted against civilian populations on a daily basis in Donbass, Lugansk, Belgorod, all miraculously invisible to the Western media.
So, one thing that really strikes me about what you said, and for those that are watching, please check out his whole speech because it was very powerful. It got a lot of comments. In fact, Russian Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky stated that both Chay's speech and Max Blumenthal's speech were some of the best he had heard in his career. And that was a high compliment from him. He was very impressed with what you had to say, Chay. And of course, Max as well. But this brings us to this present moment, because you brought up those good points about the weapons and the damage it's doing to any hope of lasting speech or diplomacy to come down. And just today, Jake Sullivan announced with Karine, what's her name? Same Jean-Pierre, the White House press secretary.
Clown Pierre, I like to call her.
Whatever, Clown Pierre. That they are going to allow more than what was expected of cluster bombs, and those cluster bombs are outlawed by 10 nations. And I think it's an average of 4 out of 7 are duds, and so that causes damage to civilians and children. Because you have a lot of those, because you have this bomb and then boom, it explodes into 100 tiny bombs, but then if it doesn't, it's a dud, then it can be found by a civilian or a child. That's why these are banned. So could you talk a little bit and educate the audience about just how awful the fact that the US is doing this? Because this is, in my opinion, it's horrendous that this is coming down the pike.
Yeah, well, I mean, this was the core of what we were talking to the UN about, which was this insanity of flooding Ukraine with very exceptionally portable weapons. On one occasion in my speech, I mentioned on one afternoon, 6 kilometers from the center of Kiev, the Zelensky regime handed out 18,000 automatic weapons to the population. Absolutely no training required. Turn up, show any form of ID, and you got a Kalashnikov rifle, as much ammunition as you could carry, grenades, handguns, pistols, 18,000. And this is all verified by the Ukrainian government. The saturation of Ukrainian society with these weapons is unprecedented. We're already seeing them filtering into Europe, into gangland. They're already turning up. There's anecdotal evidence that during the unrest in France, some of these weapons were used against French police. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stated that Western anti-tank weapons that were supplied to Ukraine are now on the borders of Israel, ready to be deployed against Israeli tanks by the enemies of Israel. That's why he's not going to send any more weapons. The Bulgarian Prime Minister in the last 2 days said, we're not sending any more weapons into Ukraine because it's exceptionally corrupt and it's going to end up, on the periphery of one of our airports. I mean, this is anecdotal. I mean, Stinger missiles, which were flooded into Ukraine, one of those can take down an airliner full of anybody on any European airport. There's no air defense systems there. So this was the rationale of our discussion. How does flooding the most corrupt country on earth with exceptionally portable and valuable and saleable weapons end a conflict? We're not talking about heavy weapons, the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of artillery rounds. And now what you mentioned, Tara, is the provision by a desperate Biden regime. And remember, this is probably the 7th or 8th game changer that's going to be sent to Ukraine. It began with helmets and body armor. Then it began with Javelin anti-tank missiles. They were going to stop the Russians. It was going to end the war. Then it was the M777 howitzer, which was going to destroy the Russians. Didn't happen. And then it was, heavy vehicles, heavy artillery, rocket systems. Then it was, of course, the tanks, the Leopards. The Leopards were going to be released. Release the Leopards. Paul Massaro and these fantasists, these think tank sort of fetishists like McFaul and Massaro. The Leopards are burning. The Bradley vehicles are burning. The missiles are being shot down. Russia has the best anti-aircraft system ever developed in history, the S-400. and it's about to sort of commission into service the S-500, which can destroy an F-16 fighter, 500 kilometers away. So Ukraine can't win this war. It's a factual strategic impossibility. Nobody with an independent strategic or military education could in any way defend a position where they say it could. The Ukrainian army has been long defeated. The Ukrainian army trained by NATO between 2014 and 2022 is under the ground, unfortunately. Over 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Their material, equipment, their Soviet-era tanks, air defense systems have all been burned. Now this is basically what started as NATO assisting Ukraine in a proxy war against Russia is now Ukraine supplying badly trained manpower to a second-rate NATO-supplied military to throw themselves against these prepared Russian defenses in the east. This, remember, 6 months ago, the Ukrainian high command were saying that within 2 weeks they would be at Melitopol, they would be cutting through the Russian defenses. We're a month plus now into this debacle of a counteroffensive. The losses of the Ukrainian military are astonishingly high. Remember, the Ukrainian government has made it illegal to report on the losses of the Ukrainian military. It's banned the opposition. It's banned a language. It's oppressed a religion. It's imprisoning journalists, and it's been doing that for a long time. It's prosecuting its own prosecutors in this faux anti-corruption move. This is the kind of country that the United States would have invaded if the people weren't white. So you got to understand that the fantasy narrative that Ukraine is winning and will win helps only one group of people, and that's the Russian military, which is sucking in these advancing hordes of conscripted Ukrainian boys and men who are dying in their thousands. For what? For this mirage of being brought into NATO. Today, it was made very clear that Ukraine will never join NATO in what it's engaged in a conflict with Russia. It's also been made very clear that Ukraine will never join the EU until there's massive economic reform. Mm-hmm. And it's also been made very clear that, the only interest the West has, organizations like BlackRock and these predatory commercial interests, the only interest they have in Ukraine is to make profit. And the military-industrial complex of which Lloyd Austin, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, is an ex-board member of Raytheon. I mean, come on. I mean, how insane is this? A max.
Yeah, and Leon Panetta, who is my old boss, he's trotting out on MSNBC and CNN talking about how we have to give more weapons to Ukraine. He sits on the board of Raytheon as well. So
and I urge people to listen to Max Blumenthal speak, where he takes this military-industrial complex, the grimy nexus between the military-industrial complex and the U.S. political elite. He takes it apart like a Lego set in his speech. It's absolutely beautiful to watch. I'd advise anyone watching us tonight to watch that speech and watch it 3 times, because you're going to need that amount of time to digest the level of complexity of this nexus, this predatory nexus between creating a narrative where Russia is the enemy, creating a coup d'etat against a democratically elected government. The Viktor Yanukovych government was elected democratically. Then that's not me saying this. This is the UN, the EU, the OSCE. He was elected democratically, and then Victoria Nuland, John McCain, et al. Turn up in Maidan Square during a coup and start saying, we want a new government. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. You don't get to do that. We don't. When Trump goes to the Capitol, this is an insurrection. When Nuland goes in the middle of a revolution, what they class as revolution, which was a coup into Ukraine, this is stimulating democracy. So it's just fallacy.
Stimulating democracy.
It's just a joke.
Her cookies stimulated something, didn't they?
Giving out cookies to neo-Nazis, and selecting who the next boss was going to be. It's just remarkable. The level of the minutiae of which they interfered in Ukrainian affairs is remarkable.
It is. It is. Hey, Reef. I got you on the line here. So what happens sometimes? And I like the whiskey that you're drinking. What kind of whiskey are you drinking there, Chay? So we can recommend it. Is that good Irish whiskey, Scott? What?
Bushmills whiskey will now cancel all exports of Bushmills. And by the way, I shouldn't even be drinking Bushmills because it's a very loyalist, pro-British distillery up in the north of Ireland. But it's the best. It's the best.
Oh, get your boots off my throat, Chay. Come on.
Don't tell anybody.
Yeah, don't tell anybody. Okay, so Reef, do we have any questions or comments for Chay in the chats there?
I had one that asked about specifically, has there been any more talks of peace talks, and if there's been any updates with that?
Oh, yeah. That's kind of a natural segue, actually, as we wrap up the show. What's here we are, and you studied this intensely, academically, but now you're living it existentially, right, Chay?
Yeah.
Where are we going? Are we going to nuclear? Because like a lot of people, even Scott Ritter, are saying we're close to nuclear war. We're close to a World War III, or in it.
Yeah. Well, I like to think
or are we headed to peace? Where are we?
Yeah, I like to believe that won't happen. It didn't happen during the Cold War. It didn't happen on a couple of other occasions. I like to believe that there are too many middle-aged, overweight white men who stand to lose too much from a nuclear holocaust because there's nothing left for anybody. So you want to keep your big apartment in Florida. You want to keep your huge pension, your shares in Raytheon. There's not going to be another war if we see World War III. I think it was Einstein said, I don't know how they're going to fight World War III, but they'll fight the next war will be fought with sticks and stones. So the idea, first of all, there is a real possibility that the United States would come out on the wrong end of a nuclear clash with Russia. Russia has a far more advanced nuclear arsenal than the United States does, and it has a far more lethal method of delivery of that in the Sarmat complex, which it could probably vaporize the whole of the United States before they got out of bed. Not that anybody in Russia remotely thinks that that's something that would be wanted or, even imaginable. But
no, I mean, there's a first strike. They have a law where they will not do the first strike. It's already
the Russian constitution forbids Russia from using nuclear weapons other than in a retaliatory strike. But remember, in 1945, the United States and Britain concocted a plan called Operation Unthinkable, which basically posited the theory that the United States and Britain would launch a nuclear assault against the Soviet Union. They would launch nuclear weapons at 12 large Russian cities, wipe out those cities, and then carve up Russia. So look it up. It's called Operation Unthinkable. Thankfully, nothing ever came of it. But the idea that NATO and the West have never contemplated, that we want nothing but peace with Russia, it doesn't wash. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the Warsaw Pact, which was constituted of Poland and Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, this Warsaw Pact, which was the NATO on the Soviet side, it was disbanded. It disappeared. Why didn't NATO disappear in 1991, Tara? Why did NATO stay on the field? What were they waiting for? Who were they there to fight? I mean, NATO was constituted, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was created to counter the spread of Soviet communist ideology in Europe and in the North Atlantic region. When the Soviet Union ceased to exist and when the Warsaw Pact ceased to exist, why did NATO not cease to exist? And I would suggest NATO didn't cease to exist because NATO needs weapons. It's a political functionary of this neoliberal hegemony that needs to replicate American life in every culture. Forget about what religion you are. Forget about thousands of years of your culture. We're going to turn the Taliban into barbecuing guys with cowboy hats. That ain't going to happen. And we worked that out after 20 years, $3 trillion, thousands of dead Americans, and leaving the Taliban standing in Humvees with 50 cal machine guns and billions of dollars of weapons. And now trying to talk to them to try and get them to play a game on our side. American foreign policy has been the greatest misadventure of the American project. If American
That's great. I like that quote. I want to keep that quote. Say it again.
Well, look, if American foreign policy was a job applicant, okay, and you looked at his CV, he's coming in for a job, you'd say, this guy's a sociopath. He's a fucking killer. He's mad, okay? This guy, since the end of the Second World War, the US military has killed over 13 million people, probably, in dozens of countries. They've gone around the world destabilizing democracies, executing people, assassinating the leaders of countries, or attempting to do so. But then they're called themselves the good guys. If this was a CV of a job applicant, you wouldn't let him park his car in the parking lot. You'd call security, say, don't let that guy even into the parking lot. He's insane, okay? But when Russia, after 20 years of warning the West about the encroachment of NATO into what were Soviet states with significant Russian-speaking populations, who found themselves trapped outside of the walls of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, by no fault of their own, huge populations, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Russian speakers who consider themselves Russian, ethnic Russian, Moldova, Ukraine, where the whole society is stratified east to west from significantly Russian, Crimea, a country which is absolutely Russian in language, culture, and history, centuries and centuries of Russian culture. Odessa, a city established by Catherine the great Russian empress, if you like. But, in 1954, I think, 53, 54, Nikita Khrushchev gave Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic as a gift to solve an argument over wheat prices. So were the people in Crimea Russian the day before this transaction occurred? Of course they were. Are they still Russian today? Of course they are. How could Russia invade a country without firing a shot if the population of Crimea weren't exclusively Russian and pro-Russian, as they are today, as they will be tomorrow? So this a la carte application of democracy, the idea that the people in the new republics in Russia, Donbass, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, these people who've been Russian for centuries, before the even modern Russian state existed, they considered themselves Rusnaya, they were Russian. The idea that they're going to be subsumed into some forced Ukrainian state, which is essentially run from the EU by people like von der Leyen, this exceptionally ignorant woman who doesn't understand history or culture, unelected, anti-democratic bureaucrat who runs the EU. We can talk about the EU another time. But the idea that these people are going to be forcibly subsumed into a right-wing sort of anti-Russian rump state of Ukraine, it's an absolute, I call it a think tank fantasy. And it's this think tank fantasy that fuels this online NAFO insanity where these, rabid sort of men in their mother's bedrooms dressed up as puppy dogs, attack people who actually talk about facts and reality. Yeah, you've seen it. So there doesn't seem to be any adults in the room anymore. There's no adults in the room. People like John Mersheimer, the great realist scholar, fantastic man, exceptionally intelligent. Years and years talking about the reality of this conflict, and he predicted it almost succinctly to the day. People like Stephen Cohen, people like Noam Chomsky, exceptional scholars. And a lot of realists, a lot of actual people in the US military as well, who've said, this is Russia's red line. You don't push the Russians. Don't keep the bear, or the bear will eventually come at you and you'll be sorry. And what do they do in the midst of this failing proxy war in Ukraine? They start poking the dragon. How do we get out of this one? Blinken to Biden. Jesus, Joe, what are we going to do now? We've really fucked it up in Ukraine. I've got an idea. Let's fuck it up with the Chinese. Brilliant. Let's do it.
Let's just. Right. I know.
Hello?
Foreign policy is a disaster. I mean, it started with the pullout of Afghanistan and that huge debacle, $70 billion mistake, and then people left behind and carnage, and started awful with the way that happened, and then went downhill from there. But Chay, I just am always impressed with your wit and your wisdom, and I want to thank you for being with us tonight. I was hoping that you could tell our audience where they can find you if they have questions or they want to hear more of your work.
Yeah, sure. Well, I suppose the main platform I use is Twitter. It's at Bowes Shay on Twitter. I have a Telegram channel, Irishman in Russia, if you're interested in that. And I'm trying to sort of build a sort of a platform, maybe with you and others. We're trying to make it more accessible to have these kind of debates where we can talk to the good people of the US and of Europe and the UK to sort of shine a light of reason onto this and hopefully mobilize ordinary people to prevent these sort of people who are, you know, deeply intertwined with the profit-making rationale of these perpetual wars to do things differently. Maybe, Tara, I think that's what our job is right now.
Absolutely, I agree with you, and I'm really honored and happy to call you my friend and colleague, and I look forward to more of these conversations. So I hope you'll come back, you know, and talk some more.
Sure.
We'll talk next time, part 2 on the EU, and you can give some insights there. Yeah. So
yeah, be delighted.
All right. Well, thanks everyone. And to everyone listening, I know it's been a long break for me, but now I'll be regular. I will be still coming from Moscow. But again, I want to thank Reef, Indie News Network, Greg, Mad Crab Greg for all his artwork. And I want to thank Misty for all she does, and all the family at Indie News Network who has made this show possible and continues to give that support. And Reef is always ready on the go to do a show, and at any time, day or night. Luckily, this is at least in the afternoon for you, Reef, as opposed to in the middle of the night when we've had to do some of them.
Yeah.
So yeah, so goodbye from this side of the pond. And you know what I want to say to my Western friends that are watching is think independently. Follow independent Telegram channels like Chay's, follow RT, follow another narrative, and get another view. So till next time, we'll see you next Friday. And we'll have a really great guest. I'll tell you more about it later this week. Take care.